Let's get right to our breaking news. A major court loss for the Trump administration. A federal judge says President Trump's use of the National Guard in Los Angeles was illegal. The judge ruling the deployment violates the Posse Comitatus Act, and he warns President Trump's calls to send troops into other American cities would amount to a national police force with the president as its chief. Before this ruling, Trump teased that Chicago is next on his list for troops. The administration is already planning to surge federal resources for immigration arrests there. Chicago's mayor has taken preemptive steps to try and rein in any federal action President Trump takes. For more on all of this, we are joined by NBC senior Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley and immigration attorney Alan Orr. So Julia, what else are we hearing from this judge? How big of a deal is this ruling?
Well, it's a big ruling when you think about how Trump wants to use the National Guard next. He's already toyed with the idea of possibly sending them to Chicago, something that leaders in that state of Illinois have pushed back on, as well as the mayor of Chicago. And this is also something that we've seen in D.C., although he did have more authority. He has authority over the D.C. National Guard because of its position as the capital city. But since Trump started deploying the National Guard in L.A., which he said was to quell unrest after protests there that started because of ICE arrest, there's been a question about whether or not the president has the authority to call in the state's National Guard. Governor Gavin Newsom said he did not, and whether or not how long he can keep them there and what kind of duties they can be performing. It is against this law known as Posse Comitatus, a late 1800s law that said that the military cannot be used to enforce domestic law. It's the same reason why military can't be arresting immigrants when they cross the border. That would be enforcing a domestic law within the borders of the United States. And so in this case, this judge is saying that this was a violation to send National Guard to California. And so now that will be a big question going forward for the Trump administration. Do they continue to push? We've seen them push back court orders in the past. They will likely appeal this. And will they then decide that there is some other justification for sending National Guard to Chicago? One last thing, Anna, what was already so unusual about the idea of sending the National Guard to Chicago is they said they were doing it to crack down on crime there. That's really going a step further than what they did in Los Angeles, where they said it was to respond to unrest. The National Guard has been used in the past to respond to unrest. Sometimes that didn't go very well, like in the 70s during Vietnam protests, but it has been used in that way. In Chicago, to call them in preemptively already raised legal questions. So after a judge is saying they weren't used correctly in California, it's unclear how the White House might pivot or if they'll change their course with the actions they have planned for Chicago.
Well, let's get that answer, if we can, from NBC News senior White House correspondent Gabe Gutierrez, who is joining us as well. What is the reaction there, Gabe, from the White House to this judge's ruling? And does it force them to change their approach to Chicago and other cities?
Well, hi there, Anna. Good morning. Well, we are still waiting that reaction from the White House. They are certainly digesting this ruling at this point. So we do not have that immediate reaction just yet. But it is unlikely, Anna, that the administration will back down on some of these other plans. They have been talking about sending federal resources to other cities, as you've been pointing out, including Chicago, Baltimore, New York City. And the president this morning even doubling down on his plans for Chicago, saying on social media that he will clean up that city if he has to. Now, the question is, Anna, how exactly will local officials continue to respond? Over the weekend, you had Chicago's Democratic Mayor Brandon Johnson signing that executive order prohibiting local resources, local police from collaborating with federal law enforcement and federal immigration officials. Now, this afternoon, we're expecting a news conference from Governor J.B. Pritzker to talk more about what might come next from his end. Right now, we do not have a timetable on when the White House may deploy additional federal resources to Chicago, but it does appear to be imminent. Over the weekend, Chicago's mayor said that he believed it would be days, not weeks, before the Trump administration deployed more resources there. And from what we understand, there was that naval base just outside of Chicago that would be used for logistical support. But again, it is unclear with this breaking news of this court ruling in Los Angeles how it will impact these plans. That's certainly a question we'll be asking the White House throughout the day on.
So, Alan, how significant is this ruling from the judge in your perspective? And what happens if the administration doesn't follow it?
I think it's very significant, and it's not just California, because it also has been resounded in D.C. about the use of these troops with regards to local laws. So it isn't so much that the president was pushed back, but that the Constitution and the way our government has always run is being upheld, and it's very significant. So the Trump administration may push, and of course, it doesn't fix the harm that has already been done by the troops or all the illegal actions that have taken place. So we're not exactly making California whole. We're just stopping a process that's in the middle of it. And the administration is likely to push back, but it's a very expensive pushback at this case because Chicago is 3 times bigger than DC, and he really has not really addressed all the crime in DC, just some of the wards in DC, not the whole area. And LA, as we've already seen on this network, is only a couple of streets, not really the main of all of LA. So this concept that the National Guard is going to be a supplant for police forces in local government is not a positive result for us. It's costly. The National Guard is away from their jobs, which is costing other companies money and our readiness for military readiness. And it's also just not a good look.
Well, and of course, in D.C., it's a little bit different because the president has some authority over the National Guard there. We're not talking about a more sovereign state or a city within a different state like we're seeing with L.A. in California or Chicago and Illinois. Julia, do we have any sense of a timeline for Chicago? Could this ruling hold that operation up when we're talking about moving in the immigration crackdown that you've mentioned?
I don't think it'll stop the immigration crackdown, Anna. We know that Border Patrol is already working to set up a naval base just north of the city as a staging area, where we understand that some federal agents from ICE, Border Patrol, and DOJ components like ATF and DEA can sleep as they're surged into this city. We know at least 200 agents have already been tapped to go, and we expect more. Now, National Guard was supposed to support that mission, as well as an overall crackdown on crime in Chicago. So the crime operation could be put on hold. We'll have to wait and see what Gabe gets and what the White House says about this ruling. But as far as immigration, they can continue to surge the resources of federal agents there and do more arrests and even try to go into areas where they may have targets for the worst of the worst, or do things like what we saw Border Patrol do in Los Angeles, where they were doing sweeps of Home Depot parking lots, even though that was also ruled illegal by a judge. They still went through and continued to do that, even coming out of a rental truck in a Home Depot parking lot after that ruling. So I don't know that this will do much of a dent in terms of the immigration operation there. Certainly the optics may be changed if they don't have National Guard there to support those missions. But as far as I'm hearing so far, DHS is still pushing lots of resources into Chicago to arrest immigrants there.
And Alan, as Gabe mentioned just a few minutes ago, Chicago's mayor, Brandon Johnson, signed an executive order directing the city to use every legal mechanism to.
We have some breaking news. A federal judge just ruled that both President Trump and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth violated the law by using the military and the Los Angeles area over the summer. The Trump administration deployed thousands of federalized California National Guard members and Marines during an immigration crackdown in June. And this decision comes as the president weighs, as we were just talking about, whether to send National Guard members to other cities, as he has done in Washington, D.C. Joining us now is former federal prosecutor and Politico magazine senior writer Ankush Khardori. Ankush, thank you for coming here. So what is the judge's reasoning here?
Well, the judge's reasoning is fairly straightforward. He says that the Posse Comitatus Act prevents the deployment of the military on U.S. soil for normal law enforcement operations. And he held, after conducting a trial on this matter, that the National Guard was deployed in California for normal law enforcement operations, arrests, searches, stops, helping execute search warrants and things like that. And he said that this is illegal. And one thing I would point out that may get lost in the shuffle as we cover this, it is not really going to be relevant given the president runs the Justice Department effectively, but violations of the Posse Comitatus Act are a crime under ordinary circumstances, a low-level crime, but a crime nonetheless.
So what would the consequences be potentially for the president or defense secretary? Also, given the fact that this is after the National Guard had been deployed there and then left.
Yeah, so as to the criminal side, I mean, again, I don't expect the Justice Department to do anything about this since it's now the Trump Justice Department. With respect to the civil, on the civil side, though, you're right that most of the National Guard members are gone, but the judge said that there's still some remaining here. So even if it's in the low hundreds, his order requires them essentially to leave or to stop engaging in the conduct that was at issue here.
So then how do you expect this legal decision to impact President Trump's plans to possibly deploy National Guard troops to other cities like Chicago or New York, especially after he has done so here in D.C.? And what does it mean for the National Guard troops here in D.C. right now?
This is the National Guard in D.C. operates under a different legal framework. So this doesn't really tell us much about the legality of the National Guard deployment in D.C. With respect to L.A. and California, I would expect DOJ to appeal. We'll see. As for the effect of this decision on the administration's decision to deploy the National Guard in other states, look, under ordinary circumstances, under prior administrations, you would expect the White House to take this extremely seriously and or to deter them from those sorts of deployments. We do not know, given the way that this administration has conducted itself, whether it will actually take that position, because as we learned during the Supreme Court litigation over the injunctions, the universal injunctions, you may recall, the Justice Department's position was effectively, we can kind of do whatever we want, whatever jurisdiction, unless and until we get a circuit court ruling or an appeals court ruling. So they may decide to plow ahead. Last thing I'll just say here is that even if they, I think, were to decide to do so, I think one of the reasons we've seen them pull back a bit is because polling showed that these deployments of the National Guard were quite unpopular.
What you're seeing here is bad news for Trump. It's bad for his ego, and it's bad for his broader project, because what this is demonstrating is that what he did in LA with the National Guard was illegal, and it's likely therefore going to be illegal anywhere in the United States. Maybe not DC. I'll talk about that, but certainly his plans for what he wants to do in New York and Chicago and basically any democratically run city in the country, right? Because Trump isn't sending National Guardsmen and National Guardswomen to red states and red cities that have higher crime rates and have had rising crime rates. He's sending them to blue cities that in many cases are seeing declines in crime rates. Doesn't mean the situation is perfect in those cities, but it does mean that it's like if you were going to need these resources, there's many redder parts of the country, a lot of rural areas that voted 70-80% Trump that have higher crime rates than New York or Chicago or LA or DC per capita, right? DC is a bit different because DC is under the federal government. Trump probably does have more leeway there because it's considered like federal territory in that sense. It's one of the reasons why, for example, it's not a state, it's a federal district. But Trump doesn't want to just target DC. He's talking about Baltimore. He's talking about Chicago, again, New York, going back to LA. This really makes his scheme harder. And it also just demonstrates that the system is holding up more than he thought it would. This isn't a sign for us to breathe a sigh of relief and stop fighting, stop protesting. Of course not, right? But it is a sign that, like, Donald Trump's dream of a frictionless fascist takeover isn't coming to fruition, because the courts have stood up in many cases, because importantly, maybe the most of all, you, the people, have stood up in many cases, and Donald felt everything would go his way, and a lot of things aren't.